She did not cry when her stepmother handed her over like a sack of grain at the edge of town. She did not beg. She did not reach for the doorframe or throw herself onto the dirt road and scream the way every nerve in her body told her to. Abigail Carter was 19 years old, built wide and solid like the mountains above her, and she stood perfectly still, while her stepmother Margaret placed a single suitcase at her feet and turned away without looking back. The wagon was already waiting. The man inside it had a scarred face and a ruined leg, and nobody in the valley expected her to survive the winter. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every single comment means the world to us. Now let's begin. The morning Margaret Hayes announced what she had done, she did not phrase it as a trade. She never used that word. She called it an arrangement. She called it an opportunity. She stood at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her chin lifted, and she said in the same flat voice she used to assign chores, "Elias Whitmore needs a wife who can handle the mountain. I've agreed you'll go to him by Friday." Abigail was standing at the stove. She had a cast iron pan in her right hand and 3 strips of salted pork sizzling in it, and for a moment she didn't move at all. The grease popped and hissed. The smell of wood smoke and bacon fat filled the low kitchen ceiling. Outside, the rooster was making noise in the yard, and Clara was still asleep upstairs, the way Clara always was, until half the morning was already gone. "Come again," Abigail said. "You heard me." Margaret sat down. She reached for the bread on the table and began cutting herself a slice. "He came down to town 2 days ago. He's getting on in years, and his leg's been bad since that business up at the ridge last fall. He can't manage alone through another winter. He needs someone who can work." Abigail set the pan down on the iron rest. She turned around slowly. "You're sending me to Elias Whitmore." "I said what I said. Margaret." She kept her voice even. She had learned years ago that raising her voice in this house got her nothing except a longer list of tasks and a cold supper. "Elias Whitmore is a man nobody in this valley will go near. They say he's half wild. They say he injured 2 men who tried to take timber off his land. They say, I know what they say." Margaret waved her hand. "People say all manner of foolish things about men who frighten them. He's a landowner. He's solvent. He needs a capable woman, and I have one to spare." That last sentence hung in the kitchen like smoke. One to spare. Abigail looked at her stepmother for a long moment. Margaret had a pleasant face when she chose to show it smooth and practical, the face of a woman who had made difficult decisions her whole life and had stopped losing sleep over them. She was not a cruel woman in the way people talked about cruelty. She never struck Abigail. She never screamed at her. What she did was quieter and harder to name. She simply treated Abigail like a tool, something useful and durable and interchangeable, something you didn't need to be gentle with because it wasn't going to break. "Clara is 17, Abigail said carefully. "She's old enough to—" "Clara is not going to the mountain." "Why not?" "Because Clara is delicate." Margaret said it without apology, without even the pretense of softening it. "She always has been. You know that." "Clara spent last Sunday dancing at the Harmon barn until midnight and rode home in a cart without a coat and didn't so much as sniffle." "That is not the point." "Then what is the point, Margaret? Say it plainly." Margaret set down her bread knife. She looked up at Abigail with those flat, careful eyes, and she said it plainly. "You are stronger. You have always been stronger. This is not an insult. It is simply a fact. Elias Whitmore needs someone who can chop wood and haul water and manage a cabin through a Colorado winter, and you can do all of those things. Clara cannot. This is not about fairness. This is about what makes sense." Abigail stood very still. The pork was burning. She turned back to the stove and moved the pan off the heat, and she did not say another word, because there was nothing left to say that Margaret hadn't already decided not to hear. She found out the rest of it from old Pete Garner at the feed store, because of course Margaret hadn't told her everything. She never did. Abigail had gone into town that afternoon under the pretense of picking up sugar and thread. and Pete had looked at her with the expression of a man who knows something uncomfortable and can't decide whether telling it will make things better or worse. "I heard," he said finally when she asked him straight. "Tell me." Pete scratched the back of his neck. He was a good man, Pete. He'd known her since she was a child, since before her father died and left her in Margaret's house. "Your stepmother made an agreement with Whitmore. He gave her $30 and a new plow blade and 2 months' worth of feed for the mule." Abigail said nothing. "Abigail." "That's all right, Pete." Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "Thank you for telling me." She walked back to the house with her sugar and her thread, and she sat in the small room that had been hers since childhood, the one with the low ceiling and the window that looked out at nothing but the chicken yard. And she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she counted what she had. 1 mother's shawl, gray wool, worn soft. 2 dresses, both let out at the seams twice. A tin of buttons, saved from garments too far gone to wear. A photograph of her father taken 3 years before he died, his hand on her shoulder, and his expression proud and a little startled, the way people looked in photographs back then. $30 and a plow blade. She had been traded for $30 and a plow blade and 2 months of feed for a mule that wasn't even hers. She did not cry that night. She lay on the narrow bed, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about her father, Thomas Carter, who had been a decent and hard-working man, and who had been dead 6 years, and who, if he were alive, would not have allowed this. But he wasn't alive. That was the whole problem. She thought about Elias Whitmore. Everyone in the valley had stories about him. He had come to the northern ridge almost 10 years ago from somewhere east. Nobody agreed on exactly where, and he had built his cabin alone, which people said was impossible for one man. And he had stayed there through winters that sent other settlers fleeing back down to the flatlands. He was tall. He was dark-haired. He had a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, origin unknown, and he had the kind of face that made people step aside on a boardwalk without entirely understanding why. His leg had been bad since last fall, when something happened up on the ridge, a fall or a fight or an accident with a tree. The stories changed depending on who was telling them, and he walked now with a carved oak cane and a hitch in his step that made him look like he was always bracing for the ground to come up under him. He was 38 years old. He had buried one wife already years ago before he came to Colorado. He had not come looking for love. He had come looking for someone who could survive. On Thursday morning, the day before she was supposed to leave, Clara came to find her in the barn. Abigail was mending a harness, and Clara stood in the doorway with the morning light coming in behind her, and her hands twisted together in front of her waist, the way she did when she was nervous. "Abigail," she said. "I'm busy, Clara." "I know, Clara came a little further in. She was a pretty girl, genuinely pretty, with their shared father's dark eyes and Margaret's careful way of arranging herself. She had always been treated like something fragile, and the trouble was, she had come to believe it. "I didn't know she was going to do this. I want you to know that." Abigail kept her hands working on the harness leather. "She told me last night," Clara said. "She told me, and I told her it wasn't right. I told her—" "What did she say when you told her?" A pause. "She said it was already settled." "All right then." "Abigail." Clara's voice cracked a little on the second syllable. "I'm sorry. I truly am. If there were something I could do—" "There isn't." Abigail looked up finally. She looked at her stepsister, who was 17 and pretty, and had never once been asked to carry anything heavier than a bolt of cloth, and she felt something complicated move through her chest. Not hatred. She had never hated Clara. Clara wasn't the one making these decisions. Clara was just the reason someone else kept making them. "Go back to the house. Help your mother with breakfast." "You're not angry at me." "I'm angry at a lot of things, Clara. You're not the top of the list." Clara nodded, pressing her lips together. She almost said something else. Then she didn't. She turned and walked back to the house, and Abigail watched her go. And then she turned back to the harness, and kept working until her hands ached. Friday came the way bad days always come, without ceremony, and too quickly. Margaret had packed a small crate of preserved food, not out of generosity, Abigail understood, but because showing up empty-handed would reflect poorly on the family. There was dried beef, and 2 jars of apple butter, and a sack of dried beans, and a small wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. Margaret set it in the wagon bed without a word and went back inside. Clara stood on the porch. She raised her hand once, a small motion, more acknowledgement than farewell. Elias Whitmore sat in the front of the wagon with the reins in his left hand and his cane propped against the seat beside him. He looked at Abigail once when she came out of the house with her suitcase. A steady look, not unkind, not warm, simply assessing the way a man looks at the weather when he's trying to decide whether to push forward or wait. He climbed down from the wagon to help with her suitcase. It took him longer than it would have taken another man. He moved carefully, deliberately, managing his weight away from the damaged leg with a practiced economy of motion. He did not ask for help. He did not comment on the difficulty. He simply did what needed doing. He set her suitcase in the wagon bed. He said, "Miss Carter." She said, "Mr. Whitmore." He said, "We should get moving if we want to reach the cabin before dark." She said, "All right." She did not look back at the house. She had decided somewhere between Thursday night and Friday morning that she was not going to look back. Looking back was something you did when you believed you were leaving something good behind. She was not leaving anything good behind. She climbed up into the wagon. He climbed up on the other side slower and gathered the reins, and they moved off down the road in the early summer light with the birds going wild in the trees and the mountains ahead of them, still blue-gray with morning shadow. They didn't speak for the first hour. It wasn't hostile silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had both been through enough that they didn't feel the need to fill empty space with noise. Abigail had grown up in a house where conversation was mostly instruction, and she had gotten comfortable with quiet. Elias seemed like a man who had spent years talking only to horses and mountain wind, and he had that air about him of someone who found words a little excessive most of the time. The road climbed. The pine trees thickened on either side. The air got colder and smelled different up here, sharper with resin and something mineral underneath. The horses were strong, a pair of heavy-boned grays, and they moved uphill without complaint. Finally, Elias said without looking at her, "You want to ask me something?" Abigail considered. "A few things." "Go ahead." "Did you know what the arrangement was? The terms of it?" He was quiet for a moment. The wagon tilted slightly to the left as the road curved. "I knew what was offered. I didn't negotiate the specifics." $30, she said. "A plow blade. 2 months of mule feed." She heard him exhale slowly. "Yes." "And that seemed fair to you." He turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time she got a good clear look at his face. The scar was less dramatic in person than in description. It ran along the left side of his jaw, silvered and old, not the fresh, brutal kind. His eyes were gray, or some color close to gray, and there were lines around them from squinting into wind and distance. He was not handsome in the way men in parlors were handsome. He was handsome in the way that mountains were, which was to say that the beauty was severe and a little forbidding, and you had to look at it for a while before you fully saw it. "No," he said. "It did not seem fair." "Then why did you agree to it?" "Because your stepmother set the terms. I told her what I needed, someone strong, someone capable, someone who knew how to work. She told me you were the right person for it." He paused. "I didn't know until I got to town and heard talk that you weren't a willing party." Abigail looked back at the road ahead. "And when you heard that, I thought about turning back." "Why didn't you?" Elias was quiet for a long time. The horses clopped steadily on the packed earth. A hawk circled high above them, riding a thermal in long, lazy sweeps. "Because turning back meant leaving you there," he said at last. "And from what I heard in town, there wasn't much waiting for you if I did." She didn't answer that. She sat with it for a while, the honesty of it, the plainness of it, which was somehow worse and better than she'd expected. "What do you expect of me?" she said finally. "Work," he said. "Honest work. The cabin needs someone who can manage the cooking and the stores and the mending, and there's a kitchen garden that's gone to weed because I can't manage the bending. I need wood stacked before September. I need the horses looked after proper. In the winter, there's trapping and preserving and keeping the fire through the night." He glanced at her again. "It's hard living. I won't pretend otherwise. I know hard living." "I expect you do. And what else?" she said. "Beyond the work." He understood what she was asking. She could see that he understood it. His jaw tightened, just barely. "I am not a man who forces anything," he said. "That is not a negotiation or a kindness. It is simply who I am. You'll have your own room, your own space. What else may or may not happen between us is not something I would ever demand. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," she said. "Good." They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It had shape to it now, and edges, and something that was almost the beginning of an understanding. The cabin appeared through the trees in the long light of late afternoon, and Abigail looked at it for a long time before she said anything. It was bigger than she'd expected. Solid. Notched pine logs, a stone chimney, a wide covered porch that ran the full front length of the building. There was a woodpile to the right that was half depleted, a summer's worth of chopping barely started. A small barn sat behind and to the left, and she could hear a horse in there, and what might have been a goat. The kitchen garden Elias had mentioned was visible from the road, and it was indeed in rough shape, the beds overtaken with weeds and the early season growth struggling underneath. But the cabin itself was solid. The roof was good. The door hung true on its hinges. "You built this," she said. "Most of it. Had help with the chimney." "It's well made." "It's held 9 winters." He said it simply without pride, the way you'd state a fact about groundwater or cloud cover. He brought the wagon around to the barn, and they unloaded the horses first. He showed her where the feed was, and how much the grays got, and which bucket was the one with the crack in it that had to be set a particular way to hold water. He moved through the barn with the careful, angular grace of a man who had long ago recalibrated every physical task around his injury, and Abigail watched him without making it obvious that she was watching. He didn't need pity. She could see that clearly. He needed a partner. Inside the cabin was warm because he'd banked a fire before he left. She stood in the main room and turned in a slow circle and took in what there was to see. A long table, 2 chairs, shelves along the far wall with jars and tins organized with a precision that surprised her, a rifle over the door, hooks for coats, a floor swept clean. "There," he said, and nodded toward a door at the far end of the room. "That's yours." She opened it. A room just wide enough for the iron-framed bed and a chest of drawers and a small window that looked out at the pines. On the inside of the door, there was an iron bolt. She turned back to look at him. "I put that on last week," he said. "When I knew someone was coming." She didn't know what to do with that. She stood in the doorway of her room and looked at this scarred, hobbled, difficult man who had put a bolt on the inside of her door before she arrived, and she felt something fracture quietly inside her chest. Some tightly held thing she'd been gripping since Friday morning, since long before Friday morning. "Thank you," she said. "Supper in an hour," he said, and turned back toward the main room. "I can manage it tonight. Tomorrow we'll see how you cook." That almost made her smile. Almost. She put her suitcase on the bed, and she unpacked her 2 dresses and her mother's shawl, and the tin of buttons, and the photograph of her father. She set the photograph on top of the dresser, and she looked at it for a moment. Thomas Carter, with his hand on her shoulder, and his proud, startled expression, and she said quietly to the photograph and the pine trees outside the window and whatever else might be listening, all right then." She bolted the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed in the sharp, cold mountain air coming through the window cracks. $30 and a plow blade. She said it to herself, not to hurt herself with it, but to remind herself. Because she had a feeling standing in this room, in this solid cabin, with this particular man moving carefully around his kitchen on the other side of that door, that she was going to need to remember where she had started, so that later she would understand how far she'd come. She got up, unbolted the door, and walked into the kitchen. "I'll make supper," she said. Elias turned from the shelf where he was reaching for a tin. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. "I told you I could manage." "I know you can," she said. "But I'm here now. Let me see what you've got." He studied her for another moment with those gray, assessing eyes. Then he stepped back from the shelf. "Dried venison," he said. "Beans on the left. Cornmeal in the lower tin. There's onions hanging from the rafter. Any salt?" "Top shelf behind the small jar." "Good." She tied her apron, and she started in on supper, moving through his kitchen with the competence of a woman who had been cooking since she was tall enough to reach a stove. And she heard him pull out one of the chairs and lower himself into it. And after a while, she heard the scrape of something. He was sharpening a blade at the table, a steady rhythmic draw of whetstone on steel. The fire burned. The light outside went gold, and then orange, and then the deep blue of mountain evening. The smell of venison and onion and cornbread filled the cabin. They ate in silence, which at this point felt natural to her. The food was good. She knew it was good. She didn't say so, and neither did he. But when she looked up once, she caught him eating with a particular focused attention that was its own kind of compliment. After supper, she washed the dishes and he dried them, standing beside her at the basin, and they worked around each other in the small kitchen with the careful courtesy of two people who did not yet know each other's rhythms, but were paying attention. "You're not what I expected," Elias said when the last dish was set on the shelf. "No," she agreed. "Neither are you." What did you expect? She thought about it honestly. Someone who deserved the things people said about him. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. "And," he said. "And I'm revising my thinking." He nodded once the way men nod when they've received something they needed but didn't know how to ask for. He took his cane from where it leaned against the table and said goodnight, and went to his room, and she heard the door close, and then she stood alone in the main room of this cabin in the Colorado mountains, 19 years old. And she listened to the wind in the pines, and the settling of the fire, and the improbable quiet of this life she had not chosen but had somehow ended up inside. She was not happy. She was not peaceful. Those things would take more time and trust than one evening could hold. But she was not afraid. That was new. That was something she hadn't felt in a long time, the simple absence of fear. And she held it carefully in the center of her chest, like a coal in cupped palms, small and warm, and possibly the beginning of a fire. She went to her room. She bolted the door. She lay on the strange bed in the dark, and the mountain breathed around her vast and cold and full of its own particular silence, and somewhere out in those trees a night bird called once, and then was quiet. Abigail Carter closed her eyes. She did not dream of home. She thought about the bolt on the inside of the door put there the week before by a man who didn't know her, who didn't owe her anything, who had simply decided that whoever was coming deserved to feel safe. Maybe the people who traded you away could only tell you so much about your worth. Maybe some places and some people proved them wrong. She slept. Morning came hard and bright through the pine trees, the way mountain mornings always do, sudden and cold and absolutely without mercy. And Abigail was up before the light had fully settled because she had never in her life slept past what the day needed from her, and she wasn't going to start now. She dressed quickly. She braided her hair. She unbolted the door and walked into the main room and found it empty. The fire banked low, Elias's cane gone from its place beside the table. She stirred the fire up and got it burning proper and put water on for coffee, and she was standing at the window when she heard the sound of axe on wood from somewhere behind the cabin. She went out. He was at the woodpile working with his coat still on against the morning cold, managing the axe one-handed when he needed the other hand free, his damaged leg braced carefully with each swing. It was slow work. She could see that it cost him. His jaw was set tight, and his breath came in hard, visible puffs in the cold air, and there were deep circles under his eyes that said he hadn't slept as long as she had. He heard her step and looked up. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She looked at the woodpile at what was done and what wasn't. "Show me the technique." "It's just splitting." "I know it's just splitting. Show me how you've got these rounds positioned." "I want to do it the way you want it done." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, that gray-eyed, considering look that was him deciding something. Then he showed her. He talked her through the angle and the grain and the way he wanted the split pieces stacked bark side out, air gaps between the layers, short lengths separate from long. He was precise about it, detailed in a way that told her he'd spent time thinking about this system, that the system mattered to him. She took the axe. She split wood. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, built for it, with the kind of broad, strong shoulders and centered weight that made the work efficient rather than just hard. She worked steadily, and he watched for the first few minutes and then went to the barn, and she kept at it, working through the cord of unsplit rounds, with the morning light strengthening around her, and her breath steaming, and her shoulders settling into the rhythm. When she stopped an hour later, she had split more than Elias likely would have managed in half a day. He came out of the barn and looked at the pile. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Coffee's on?" she said, and went inside. He came in a few minutes after her and poured himself a cup and stood at the window with it, and she made biscuits while the silence worked around them. And it was a good silence, she decided. A productive one. The kind that meant two people were present and paying attention and not wasting energy performing anything. "The garden," she said when the biscuits were in the oven. "What about it?" "I want to see what's worth saving and what needs pulling after breakfast." He nodded. "And I need to understand the water situation. Is there a creek or a spring?" "Spring 50 yards behind the barn. Good water. Runs year-round." He paused. "There's a bucket trail. I'll show you." "All right." She took her coffee, and she sat down at the table across from him, and for the first time they sat together in that cabin in the early morning. Two people at a plain table with plain cups, and the fire burned, and the biscuits rose in the oven. And outside the mountain, day opened up around them, enormous and demanding, and entirely indifferent to what either of them was feeling. After breakfast, he showed her the spring trail. A narrow path through the pines, 50 yards exactly, angling down behind the barn, to where a shelf of gray granite forced the water up from the hillside in a clear, cold surge that fed a small stone basin someone had built up years before. She tested the water with her cupped hand. Ice cold and clean tasting. She understood immediately why he'd stayed on this particular patch of mountain when he could have settled easier ground. "This is why the cabin is here," she said. "Partly," he agreed. "Also the eastern exposure. Morning sun on the windows. Matters in winter." "You thought about it carefully." "I had time to think." He was looking at the spring, not at her. "When I came here, I wasn't in a state to make fast decisions. I walked this whole ridge 3 times before I chose the spot." She didn't ask what state he'd been in. The story of how a man ended up alone on a Colorado mountain with a dead wife behind him and a scarred face was not a story she'd earned the right to yet. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, she wasn't going to push for it. She filled the water bucket and carried it back to the cabin. She went to work on the kitchen garden. The afternoon went long and hard and satisfying in the way that outdoor physical work can be when you have the strength for it and the task is clear. She pulled weeds until her lower back ached and her knees were stained dark with mountain soil. Underneath the mess, she found that Elias had actually planted intelligently. The beds were laid out in a sensible pattern. The taller crops to the north, so they wouldn't shade the smaller ones. And there were onions and carrots, and a struggling but alive row of turnips, and the squash hills had self-seeded enthusiastically, and were putting out runners in every direction. She worked through the afternoon, and when she stood at last and pressed her hands to her lower back, she found Elias on the porch steps watching. Not intrusively, just watching the way a man watches something working well. "Supper in an hour," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." She brushed the dirt from her skirt. "I want to. It settles me cooking." He nodded. She made a venison stew with the turnips and carrots from the garden and the dried herbs she'd found on his shelf and cornbread, because the cornmeal was there, and she knew her cornbread was good. She cooked with the door open, the mountain evening coming in the sounds of Elias on the porch, running whetstone over steel, and a family of Steller's jays making loud opinions in the trees. She thought I was traded away for $30. She thought this is the second day. But she was going to be all right. She could feel the edges of it, solid, substantial, like a mountain still half in cloud but entirely present. Still there. She called him in for supper. He came. She did not know yet what Elias Whitmore was, not fully. She did not know what lay behind those careful eyes and that measured silence. What grief he carried, what wounds went deeper than the leg, what capacity he had for warmth or any of the softer things she'd spent 19 years learning not to need. She did not know whether this mountain life would make her or break her, but she knew this. She had woken up that morning without fear, and she had been traded for $30, and nobody who had traded her, not Margaret with her flat certainty, not a single person in that town who had ever looked at Abigail Carter and seen something disposable, nobody had any idea what they had thrown away. She was going to need her strength, all of it. September came to the mountain the way a debt collector comes to a door without warning, without apology, and fully prepared to take what it was owed. Abigail had been on the ridge 6 weeks by then, and she had learned more about herself in those 6 weeks than in the 19 years before them combined. She had learned that she was stronger than she'd believed, and she had learned that strength was not the same thing as invincibility. And she had learned, this one surprised her most, that she did not mind the silence up here the way she'd expected to. What she minded was the nights she heard Elias moving in his room when he should have been sleeping. The damaged leg ached in the cold. She figured that out before he ever said a word about it, because he never said a word about it. He was that kind of man, the kind who would rather drag himself through pain than ask anyone to witness it. She started leaving a small pot of water on the stove before she went to bed, heated near to boiling, and in the mornings she would find it moved. The level changed, and she didn't ask about it, and he didn't mention it. And that was how they handled most things between them in those early weeks, carefully, indirectly, with the particular delicacy of two people who had both been hurt enough that they treated each other's privacy like something worth protecting. It was a Tuesday late in that first September when the first real test came. She was in the garden pulling the last of the summer squash when she heard the horses on the road below. 2 riders. She could tell by the sound before she saw them. She straightened up and looked, and her hands tightened on the squash in her grip. She recognized the horse first. Bay gelding, with a white stripe down the nose. It belonged to Leonard Hatch, who ran the dry goods store in town, and who had on more than one occasion looked at Abigail in the way men look at women they've already decided aren't worth the full effort of politeness. The man riding beside him she didn't know. Elias came out of the barn before she'd taken 2 steps toward the cabin. He moved to the edge of the porch and stood there with his cane in his left hand and his right hand free, and he watched the riders come up the trail with the particular stillness of a man who has decided nothing is going to happen unless he decides it is. "Whitmore," Hatch called out, pulling up short of the porch. "Hatch." Elias's voice was flat and uninformative. "Heard you had a woman up here now." Hatch's eyes moved to Abigail standing at the garden edge with dirt on her hands and squash under her arm, and he looked at her the same way he always had. Like she was furniture. Like she was something he was pricing. Margaret Hayes's girl. "Miss Carter," Elias said. Hatch smiled. It wasn't a good smile. "Right. Well, the man here is Douglas Crane from the county land office. He's got some questions about your boundary markers on the western edge." Abigail watched Elias's right hand. It hadn't moved. He hadn't shifted his weight. But something changed in the quality of his stillness, a degree tighter, a degree more present the way air changes right before weather. "My markers are where they've always been," Elias said. Crane, who was a thin man in a too-clean coat that said he didn't spend much time out of doors, cleared his throat. "There's been a survey dispute, Mr. Whitmore. It's routine, I assure you. The Caldwell Land Trust has filed a claim that your western boundary encroaches." "The Caldwell Land Trust," Elias said. "Yes, sir. Mr. Richard Caldwell of—" "I know who Richard Caldwell is." Abigail's ears sharpened at that name. She had heard it before. Not in person, not yet, but in the careful way Pete Garner had avoided saying it when she'd asked him once about who owned the flatland parcels below the ridge. Richard Caldwell was the kind of name people in small valleys didn't say straight out the same way they didn't say certain other things straight out, because saying them too loud felt like inviting them in. "Is there a document?" she said. Both men looked at her. Hatch's expression shifted into something amused and dismissive at the same time. Crane looked uncertain. "Ma'am," Crane started. "A survey document," she said, setting the squash down on the porch rail and coming forward to stand beside Elias. "If there's a boundary dispute, there's a survey. If there's a survey, there's a document. Do you have it with you, or are you here to talk around the fact that you don't?" Hatch laughed, short and unpleasant. "Well, she's got some opinions." "Mr. Hatch." Elias's voice had gone quieter, which Abigail had learned in 6 weeks was more dangerous than if it had gone louder. Miss Carter asked a question. Crane reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out, and Abigail took it before Elias could move for it. She was closer, and she already had her hand out, and Crane looked surprised, as if he hadn't quite expected the woman to be the one who read documents. She unfolded it. She read it carefully. She read it twice. "This survey is dated 1871, she said. "Yes, ma'am, it's—" "Elias settled this land in 1867. She looked up at Crane. "Do you have the original homestead filing?" "That's not what I was asked to." "Because if you have the homestead filing," she said, "it would show the boundary staked at the time of settlement, which under territorial law supersedes any subsequent private survey, unless there's been a court order amending the original claim." "Has there been a court order?" Silence. Hatch was looking at her differently now. Still not with respect exactly, but with the recalibration of a man realizing he'd walked into a conversation he hadn't been prepared for. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "My father kept law books," she said. "I had a long time to read them." This wasn't entirely true. She had 3 law books, thin, old, well-worn, that she'd brought in the suitcase along with her dresses and her mother's shawl, because she'd taught herself to read them in the evenings, in that small room at Margaret's house, when there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. But the substance of what she'd said was accurate, and she could see Crane knew it was accurate, because he was folding his papers back up with the movements of a man who has discovered his errand is going to be harder than he thought. "I'll need to verify with the county records," Crane said. "That's fine," Elias said. "You do that, and when you've verified, you let me know what you find." Crane nodded. He looked like he wanted to be elsewhere. Hatch hadn't finished, though. He was still looking at Abigail, and there was something in his expression that she didn't like. Not quite threat. Not quite contempt. Something colder than either the particular look of a man who has been embarrassed in front of someone and intends to remember it. "Margaret Hayes tell you Whitmore here was a good man to end up with," he said. "Margaret Hayes told me very little about much of anything," Abigail said evenly. "I've been forming my own opinions." "That right." He gathered his reins. His eyes moved to Elias. "Caldwell's going to want a conversation, Whitmore, sooner or later. He knows where to find me," Elias said. They rode out. Abigail and Elias stood on the porch and watched them go, and neither of them spoke until the sound of horses had faded completely down the trail. "How much of that did you actually know?" Elias said. "The legal part, most of it." She picked up her squash. "The rest I was making up as I went." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a sound she hadn't heard from him before, short, low, almost involuntary. Not quite a laugh. The sound a man makes when something surprises him badly enough that his body reacts before his face can decide on an expression. "You want to tell me about Caldwell," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She'd learned to wait through his quiet. It wasn't evasion exactly. More like he took the weight of a question seriously enough to think before answering, which was a quality she had come to appreciate more than she'd expected. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put coffee on." It was the first time he'd ever offered to make the coffee. She followed him in. He told her about Caldwell, the way he told her most things plainly, without ornamentation, in the direct practical manner of a man who had decided a long time ago that making things sound better than they were Just postpone the reckoning. Richard Caldwell had been acquiring land in the county for 7 years. Not farming it, not working it, acquiring it. He had a particular method. He would wait until a settler ran into debt or bad luck or a bad winter, and then he would arrive with an offer that was always just slightly less than what the land was worth, and he had enough legal leverage through his connections to the county surveyor's office and certain judges in the territorial court that the offers were difficult to refuse even when people wanted to. He had made an offer on Elias's land 2 years ago. Elias had said no. The offer came again lower this time. Elias had said no again. That's when the survey dispute started, Elias said. He was turning his coffee cup in his hands, both hands wrapped around it, and he wasn't looking at her, but at some middle distance past her left shoulder. He found a surveyor willing to shift some numbers. Claimed my western boundary took in 40 acres of what he says is his range. And does it? No. Flat certain. I staked every inch of this land myself. I know where my boundary is. Do you have documentation? The original homestead filing. I have it. He looked at her. It's in the chest under the bed. I've kept everything. Abigail nodded slowly. Good. That's very good. She thought for a moment. What does he want? Really? Not the land. What does he want that the land is a way of getting? Elias considered that. The spring, he said. The one I showed you. The one behind the barn. There's no comparable water source on the lower range. If he controls this ridge, he controls the water for 300 acres of grazing land below. Abigail looked at her coffee. She thought about the spring, the way the water came up cold and clean from the granite shelf, the way she had tasted it in her cupped hand, and understood immediately why Elias had chosen this spot. He's not going to stop, she said. No, Elias agreed. He's not. Then we need to be ready. She realized as she said it that she had used the word we without thinking. It was the first time. She felt it land in the air between them, and she didn't take it back, and he didn't comment on it, and somehow that was the most significant exchange they'd had in 6 weeks. She started on supper. He got out the homestead filing from the chest under the bed without being asked, and spread it on the table, and she looked it over while she cooked. Turning back to it, between tasks reading the legal language, with the same careful attention she'd given those 3 thin law books over the years. She asked him questions when she needed to. He answered them. They worked around each other in that kitchen with an ease that had built up quietly over 6 weeks of close proximity and mutual need, and she was aware of it, the way you're aware of something that crept up on you. Not surprising exactly, but startling in retrospect that it had gotten this far without her noticing. Over the following 2 weeks, the mountain hardened into autumn for real. The first frost came, then the second. The mornings turned brutal, and the light went thin and gold, and the aspens on the lower slopes went the color of old coins. Abigail added a second coat to her morning routine and learned the particular rhythm of the cabin in cold weather, how the front door swelled and needed lifting slightly before it would close right, how the chimney wanted a specific draft angle, or the smoke came back inside, how the horses needed their water bucket broken out and refilled before breakfast, or they went the morning without drinking. She learned these things partly from trial and error, and partly from Elias, who communicated practical information about his home in a manner entirely lacking in sentiment, but that somehow managed to convey care, the care of a man who had kept this place alive for 9 years through effort and attention, and an absolute refusal to let it become anything less than it was. She was starting to understand that about him. That the precision, the orderliness, the way he organized the tins on the shelf, and split the wood in a particular sequence, and checked the barn twice before dark. None of it was coldness. It was the opposite. It was love expressed in the only language he'd had left after everything that had taken the other languages from him. She was splitting wood one morning in the second week of October when she heard him on the porch and looked up and found him standing with his cane and 2 cups of coffee, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "What?" she said. He came down the steps. He held out one of the cups. She took it, a little surprised. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. About what Hatch said. About Caldwell wanting a conversation. He looked out at the tree line, not at her. He's going to come up here himself, not with lawyers. He comes himself when he wants to make it personal. All right. When he does? He stopped. He seemed to be choosing the words the way he chose everything deliberately, with real attention to what they'd do when they landed. When he does, I don't want you to step back. I know most men would say, to let them handle it. You're not most men, she said. He looked at her then. Something moved in his expression. No, he said. I reckon I'm not. She took a drink of her coffee. It was good coffee, stronger than she'd made it that morning, which meant he'd put it on himself and made it the way he actually liked it, the way a man makes coffee when he's been living alone long enough that he's stopped adjusting for company. Elias, she said. Why did your wife die? She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out of whatever part of her brain was making decisions that morning independently of the more cautious parts. She felt the silence that followed like a shift in barometric pressure. He didn't answer right away. She didn't try to take it back. Fever, he said finally. 2 years after we got here, the winter of 1869. He was still looking at the tree line. She was strong, stronger than me in most ways. It took her fast. 10 days. His jaw moved. I had a doctor from 3 ridges over. He did what he could. I'm sorry, Abigail said. She would have liked you, he said. It came out quiet and certain, like something he'd thought before, and was only now saying aloud. She didn't have patience for people who put on a face. She liked people who were exactly what they were. Abigail didn't know what to do with that. She stood with her coffee cup in both hands and let the words be what they were. What was her name? She said. Ruth. That's a good name. It was right for her. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I'm not asking you to be her. I want to be clear about that. This arrangement what it is. I'm not trying to replace what I lost. I know that, she said. Good. Elias. She looked at him until he looked back at her. I didn't come up here to replace anything either. I came up here because I didn't have a choice. And then I stayed. I've stayed and I'm staying because... She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish that sentence in a way that was true, without being too much, without handing him something he hadn't asked for. Because this is worth staying for, she finished. The work, the place, She gestured vaguely. Whatever this is. He held her gaze a moment longer than he usually did. Then he said, I'm going to check the fence line on the western edge. Make sure Caldwell's man hasn't been up here moving markers. I'll come with you, she said. He didn't argue. They walked the western fence together, 2 miles of it along the ridge's backbone. Elias moving with the steady compensation of his damaged leg, and Abigail matching his pace without comment. He showed her the markers, iron stakes he'd put in himself, driven deep, each one corresponding to a number in the homestead filing. She wrote down the positions in the small notebook she'd started keeping in her apron pocket, because she'd realized early on that the thing most likely to matter in a legal fight was documentation. And documentation was only as good as how careful you were about keeping it. It was on the far western marker, the last one that she found it. A fresh stake, wooden painted red, driven in 15 feet east of Elias's iron stake with a paper tag on it that read, Caldwell Land Trust Boundary Marker. She stopped. Elias came up beside her and looked at it, and his jaw went so tight she could see the muscles working. When? She said. Recent, he said. That wood's not weathered. Last week, maybe. When Hatch and Crane were here, they could have... They came from the road, he said. Someone else came up the back trail. He looked at the wooden stake. He looked at his iron stake 15 feet away. This is what they're going to show in court. They'll say the survey shows this is the boundary, and we've been operating 15 feet into Caldwell's land. Abigail crouched down and looked at the fraudulent stake from the side, then looked at the iron stake, then looked at the ground between them. She stood up. Pull it, she said. What? Pull the wooden stake, pull it out and bring it down to the cabin. He looked at her carefully. If we leave it here, she said, it becomes part of the landscape. It becomes a thing that's been there. If we pull it now and document when and where we found it, write it down today in the notebook with both our signatures, then we have evidence that someone trespassed on your land to plant a fraudulent marker. That's a different legal situation than a boundary dispute. That's criminal trespass and evidence tampering. You're sure about that? I'm sure enough. She opened her notebook. Write the date. Write the location. Write every detail about how it looks. She held out the pencil. Then pull the stake. He took the pencil. He wrote. He pulled the stake. They walked back to the cabin in the thin October light with the fraudulent marker under Elias's arm and Abigail's notebook in her pocket. And she was thinking harder than she'd thought since she got here, running through what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out. There's a lawyer in Glenwood Springs, she said. There's a man named Harwick. He's handled land cases before. I want to write him a letter. Tonight. Elias looked at her sideways as they walked. Abigail, he said. What? Why are you doing this? The question stopped her. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because it was the first time he'd asked her something that direct about herself, about her motivations, and she realized she owed him an honest answer, and she was going to have to look at the honest answer herself first before she could give it to him. Because they thought they could take something from you, she said finally. Because men like Caldwell always think they can take things from people who are already carrying wounds, and because I have spent my whole life watching people take things from people who couldn't stop them. She looked at him. I can stop them. I think I can stop them. So I'm going to. He held her gaze. His gray eyes were darker in the afternoon light, or maybe it was just the sky going gray behind him. All right, he said. All right. Write the letter, he said. She wrote it that night after supper, sitting at the table by the lamp, while Elias sharpened a blade near the fire and the mountain wind worked at the corners of the cabin. She wrote 3 drafts before she was satisfied, the first 2 formal, the second not formal enough. The third, hitting the register she wanted, which was factual and precise, and conveyed without theatrics that this was a serious matter requiring prompt attention. She read it aloud to Elias when she was done. He was quiet for a moment. You write well, he said. I read a lot, she said. Those law books. And other things. She folded the letter. My mother left me her books when she died. Novels mostly. History. One very bad book of poetry that I read anyway because it was all I had. She sealed the letter. She believed in reading. She said a woman who could read everything had power over something even when she had power over nothing else. Elias was quiet for the moment. Then he said, She sounds like she was a lot like you. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her in 6 weeks. She felt it land somewhere below her sternum warm and a little dangerous the way real things land. She was better than me, she said. But I'm working on it. He got up to put the whetstone away, moving with his usual careful management of the bad leg, and as he passed the table, he stopped for just a moment. It's a good letter, he said. Then he went to bed. She sat at the table with the sealed letter in her hands, and the lamp burning low, and the fire settling into coals, and she thought about what she had said on the fence line. Because they thought they could take something from you. She was aware sitting there that the something she was fighting to protect had expanded quietly, without announcement, from the abstract concept of justice, or the practical matter of land rights, into something she couldn't name as cleanly. Something that included the man who had just told her she wrote well, and gone to his room with his cane and his bad leg and his dead wife's name and his 9 winters on this mountain. She wasn't ready to name it. She wasn't sure he was ready to hear it named, but she was aware of it. She banked the fire. She took the letter to the shelf by the door, where it would be ready to go with the next rider heading down to town. She bolted her door and lay down on her bed in the dark. Outside, the wind picked up hard and cold the way it did up here when a storm was building somewhere out past the range, and the cabin walls held firm around her, solid and quiet, the way they'd held through 9 winters before she was here and would hold through all the ones after. Elias sent the letters to Glenwood Springs with a rider on Thursday morning. He did it without ceremony, the way he did. Most things just handed it over with the payment and said when it needed to arrive by, and came back inside and poured himself coffee. But she'd seen him read it through one more time before he gave it to the rider standing by the door with the winter light coming in cold behind him, and she'd seen the way he folded it back up. Careful, like it mattered. November came the way Elias had warned her it would fast, and without apology. The first real snow came on a Sunday and did not stop until Tuesday, and when it was done, the mountain looked like a different country, white and still and enormous, and suddenly comprehensively serious about being what it was. She loved it. That surprised her. She had expected to hate the snow, expected to find it oppressive after the valley winters she'd known, which were cold and gray, but never quite committed to being truly winter the way this was. But up here the snow was honest. It said exactly what it meant. It said, this is what this is, and you will either learn to live inside it, or you will not. She was learning. She had learned to bank the fire properly so it lasted through the night without needing tending until dawn. She'd learned which of the horses was prone to colic if his water got too cold and needed the bucket swapped out at midnight. She'd learned to read the sky up here, which was a different sky than the valley sky, higher and faster and more direct about what it had planned. She and Elias fell into a winter rhythm that was denser than the autumn one, more interdependent because the cold made everything require more effort and more coordination. She couldn't do certain things without him, and he couldn't do certain things without her, and they both knew it, and they had both at some point she couldn't identify, stopped pretending otherwise. The letter from Harwick the lawyer arrived 3 weeks after they sent theirs. Elias brought it in from the road and set it on the table in front of her, which she noticed, which meant something. She opened it. She read it. He thinks we have a strong case, she said. The fraudulent marker combined with the original homestead filing establishes criminal trespass. He says if we can get the filing stamped and notarized in Glenwood Springs before Caldwell's people file their survey claim at the county level, we can block the dispute entirely. How long do we have? She checked the date on the letter. Thought. 3 weeks, maybe 4, before the county office reopens after the winter session. The road to Glenwood Springs is passable now. After January it won't be. Then we need to go before January. He looked at her across the table. We. I'm coming, she said. Harwick needs to meet the person who found the fraudulent marker. The law books say witness testimony about the discovery of tampered evidence. Abigail. She stopped. I wasn't arguing, he said. I was noting. She looked at him. He had an expression she was still learning, one that lived somewhere between his usual careful neutrality and something warmer, something that showed up when he thought she wasn't watching as closely as she was. Noting what? She said. He reached out slowly and turned the letter face down on the table between them, and he said, that when I came down to the valley in August, I was looking for someone to help me survive the winter. She waited. I didn't reckon on this, he said. He didn't define what this was. He didn't need to. It filled the kitchen the same way the smell of cornbread did, the same way the sound of the whetstone in the evenings did, warm and present, and more necessary than either of them had been prepared to admit. Elias, she said. Don't, he said not harshly. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you, because I think you should know. She sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside the wind was building again toward something. I know, she said quietly. I think I've known for a while. His hands resting on the table curled slightly inward, not reaching, just curling. The hands of a man holding himself to something. We'll go to Glenwood Springs, he said. After the next clear spell. After the next clear spell, she agreed. She picked up the letter and folded it back along its creases and set it on the shelf with the homestead filing and the notebook with their signatures and the fraudulent wooden stake leaning in the corner, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the parlor romance, not the grand declaration, not the story you'd tell at a social gathering in the valley. This. 2 people at a table. A letter that might save a home. Hands that almost touched and then held their own counsel. And somewhere outside Richard Caldwell, who had no idea that the woman he'd never met and the man he'd underestimated for 2 years had spent the last 3 months becoming something he was going to find considerably harder to remove than he'd planned. She went to make coffee. He got out the homestead filing to review it one more time, and the mountain held its winter silence around them, enormous and utterly indifferent, having seen enough of men and women and what they built together to know that the ones worth watching were never the ones who declared themselves, but the ones who simply kept showing up day after day, doing what needed doing, building something word by unspoken word. The road to Glenwood Springs took them 2 days. They left before first light on a Wednesday, the wagon packed with the homestead filing, Abigail's notebook, and the fraudulent wooden stake wrapped in canvas and wedged behind the seat. Elias drove. Abigail sat beside him with her hands in her lap and her mother's shawl under her coat for extra warmth, because the mountain cold at that hour had a particular bite to it, the kind that went straight through wool and found the bone underneath. They didn't talk much on the road down. That was fine. They had gotten good at productive silence, at existing in the same space without filling it unnecessarily, and the journey itself demanded attention. The trail was icy in patches, and the grays needed careful handling on the switchbacks, and Elias drove with both hands on the reins and the full weight of his concentration on the road. It was only when they reached the lower elevation where the trail widened and the ice gave way to cold mud that he said, "Harwick's office is on the main street, 2nd floor above the assay office. You've been there before." "Once, when I first filed the homestead." He adjusted the reins. "He's a straight man, doesn't take cases he doesn't believe in." "Good," she said. "I don't want a man who'll argue anything for money. I want a man who'll argue this because he knows we're right." Elias glanced at her sideways. "You think we're right?" "I know we're right." She said it plainly, the way she said most things. "The question is whether being right is going to be enough." He didn't answer that, because they both already knew the answer, which was that being right was necessary, but not sufficient, that men like Caldwell had spent years building systems where right and enough didn't always connect. Glenwood Springs hit them with noise and smell and movement after weeks of mountain quiet, and Abigail felt the shock of it in her chest, the crowd on the main street, the horses, the shouting from the saloon, even at this hour, the smell of coal smoke and something frying somewhere that made her stomach remind her they hadn't eaten since before dawn. She sat straight and kept her face composed and did not let any of it show, because she had learned in 19 years that the moment you showed people your uncertainty, they used it. Harwick's office was up a narrow staircase above the assay office, exactly as Elias had said. The man himself was smaller than she'd imagined from his letter, compact, gray-haired, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the careful eyes of someone who read fine print for a living, and had stopped being surprised by what people put in it. He stood when they came in and shook Elias's hand and looked at Abigail with an expression that was assessing without being unkind. "Miss Carter," he said, "you wrote the letter." "I did." "It was well-reasoned." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Sit down, both of you. Show me what you brought." She laid everything on his desk in order, the homestead filing first, then the notebook with the dated entries and their signatures, then the fraudulent stake unwrapped from its canvas. Harwick picked up the stake and looked at it without touching the paper tag. He set it down. He read the notebook entries twice. He spent a long time with the homestead filing. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and said, "Caldwell filed his survey claim at the county office 8 days ago." The air in the room changed. 8 days, Elias said. "I only received word yesterday. He moved faster than I expected, which tells me he knows his evidence is weak, and he's trying to establish precedents before you can respond." Harwick looked at Abigail. "The good news is that your notebook entry predates the filing. You documented that stake on October 14th. He filed on November 2nd. That means you have evidence of trespass that precedes his formal claim." "Can we contest the filing?" Abigail said. "We can do better than contest it." Harwick leaned forward. "There's a federal land commissioner coming through the territory in January. Name of Arthur Webb. He has authority to invalidate county-level survey claims if there's evidence of fraud in the original survey. If we can get your documentation in front of Webb before Caldwell's people do, we can have this resolved at a level above the county court entirely." "Caldwell has connections in the county court," Elias said. "I know he does. That's why I'm saying above it." Harwick looked at the stake again. "Who drove that stake into the ground?" "We don't know," Abigail said. "We know it wasn't there on October 7th when Elias walked the fence line. We know Hatch and Crane visited on October 9th. We know the stake appeared sometime between then and October 14th when we found it." "You'd testify to that?" Without hesitation, Harwick nodded slowly. He looked at Elias. "She does this often. Walk into a room and organize the facts better than the lawyers." "She does it constantly," Elias said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not quite pride. Something quieter and more fundamental than pride, the tone of a man reporting something true that he has come to depend on. Abigail looked at the desk and did not let herself react to it. "What do you need from us?" she said. "Sworn affidavits from both of you today before you leave. The original homestead filing, which I'll copy and return to you. The stake itself, which I'll hold as evidence." Harwick picked up his pen. "And I need you to stay in town overnight. There's a man I want you to meet this evening, a former county surveyor named Briggs. He filed a complaint against Caldwell's surveyor 2 years ago that was dismissed. If he's willing to come forward again, his testimony corroborates a pattern of fraudulent practice." "Where do we find this Briggs?" Elias said. "I'll send word to him. You take a room at the hotel on 2nd Street, and I'll have him there by 8 o'clock. Harwick looked at them both over his spectacles. "I should tell you Caldwell is not going to accept this quietly. He has a temper when he's losing, and when he gets word that you've been to see me, which he will, he may try to approach you directly." "Let him," Abigail said. Both men looked at her. "Let him approach," she said. "I've been waiting to meet Richard Caldwell. I have a few things I'd like to say to him." Harwick looked at Elias. Elias looked at Abigail with that expression she was still learning, the one made of equal parts surprise and something that had stopped being surprise weeks ago and had become something else she didn't have a clean name for yet. "She means it," Elias said. "I can see that," Harwick said. They spent 3 hours in Harwick's office that afternoon, giving affidavits, reviewing documents, listening to the lawyer lay out the case with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had spent a career building things that couldn't be knocked down. Abigail asked questions through all of it, sharp, specific questions, the kind that came from having read those 3 law books so many times. The pages had come loose from the binding, and she saw Harwick's opinion of her shift upward in real time, which was not something she was seeking, but was something she registered with quiet satisfaction because it was useful. Her opinions were useful. That was what mattered. It was nearly dark when they left his office. Elias guided her down the staircase, his hand briefly at her elbow on the last icy step, and she was aware of the warmth of it through her coat sleeve, the deliberateness of it, not possessive but careful, and she did not pull away. The hotel on 2nd Street had a dining room downstairs, and she was hungry enough by then that the smell of it hit her like a physical force when they pushed through the door. Elias got them a table, and they ordered beef stew, cornbread, coffee, and they ate with the focused attention of people who have spent a long day working hard and need the fuel, and it was only when the plates were cleared and the coffee refilled that he said quietly, "You did well today." She looked at him. "In there with Harwick," he said. "You knew more than I did about half of what he was talking about." "The law books," she said. "More than that." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, both hands the way he always did when he was working something through. "You weren't afraid of him. You weren't afraid of the situation. You just walked in and started asking the right questions." "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid the whole time." He looked up. "Being afraid doesn't mean you stop," she said. "It just means you're paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ruth used to say something like that." She held still. She used to say that courage was just fear that had somewhere to be. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it, the undertone of a man touching something that still hurt. I used to argue with her about it. I said courage was when you didn't feel the fear. She said I was wrong. A pause. She was right. She usually was, Abigail said. The corner of his mouth moved. Usually. They met Briggs at 8 o'clock in the hotel sitting room, and he was a big man, older, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors, and a permanent furrow between his eyebrows that said he was worried about something. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him when they arrived, and he stood when he saw them, and looked at Abigail with a frank professional appraisal. "You're the ones who found the stake," he said. "I found it," Abigail said. "We documented it together." He nodded. He sat back down. He looked at Elias. "Caldwell's surveyor is a man named Pratt, Benjamin Pratt. I worked with him 20 years ago in Ohio before he came out here. He was good then, careful, honest." Briggs turned his whiskey glass. "He's neither of those things now. Caldwell got to him about 4 years ago. Money, I imagine, or leverage. But the survey he filed on your property, I've seen his work when he's been paid to find what he's been paid to find. It has a particular signature." "Can you explain that to a land commissioner?" Abigail said. "I can do better than that." Briggs reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I kept copies of the complaint I filed 2 years ago, and I kept the original survey data from 3 of the parcels Caldwell acquired using Pratt's numbers. If you compare the data points to what you can physically measure and verify, the discrepancies are systematic. They're not mistakes. Mistakes are random. These go the same direction every time." Abigail took the document he offered and looked at it. Her pulse was doing something that felt like running. "This is enough," she said. "This combined with our affidavits, this is enough to take to Commissioner Webb." "If Webb is straight," Briggs said. "Is he?" Elias said. Briggs considered. "Straight enough. He doesn't like Caldwell. Caldwell tried to buy him 3 years ago and failed, which makes him the kind of man Caldwell respects and resents simultaneously." He drank his whiskey. "I'll testify. I've been waiting for someone to give me a reason. Every time Caldwell does this to someone, I think about filing again, and then I think about my wife and my children, and I don't." He looked at Abigail. "But you found that stake, and you documented it. That changes the shape of everything." "How?" she said. "Because before it was my word and some papers. My word didn't hold up last time." He leaned forward. "But a fraudulent stake, driven on a man's homesteaded land, documented by 2 witnesses before the survey claim was even filed, that's not a he said I said. That's physical evidence of premeditated fraud." The room went quiet. Elias said, "What do we do now?" And it was Briggs and Abigail who answered at the same time, Briggs saying, "Get to Webb before January," and Abigail saying, "Write to Webb tonight." And they looked at each other, and Briggs smiled for the first time, slow and weathered, and he said to Elias, "Where did you find this woman?" "The valley," Elias said. "Hold on to her," Briggs said. Abigail felt heat rise in her face, and she looked at her coffee and said nothing. And across the table, she was aware of Elias being very carefully quiet in a way that was its own kind of answer. They rode back up this mountain Thursday morning with Harwick's copies of their affidavits, Briggs's documents, and a letter already dispatched to Commissioner Webb in Santa Fe. The road was harder going up than down. The grays labored on the switchbacks, and the cold had returned overnight with a vengeance. And Elias drove with the same focused competence he brought to everything, and Abigail sat beside him and felt the particular quiet of 2 people who have done something hard together and are still in the middle of it. "He's going to find out," she said. "Caldwell. He'll know we went to Harwick." "He'll know by Friday," Elias agreed. "And then he'll come." "Yes." "Are you afraid of him?" she said. He thought about it, gave it real weight before answering. "No," he said finally. "I've been afraid of losing the land, of what losing it would mean." He adjusted the reins as the road curved. "But I'm not afraid of the man." "Good," she said. "Neither am I." They made it back to the cabin before dark. The horses were tired and hungry, and she went straight to the barn while Elias brought the documents inside, and she fed the grays and broke the ice in the water bucket and made sure they were settled before she came in herself. And when she walked into the cabin, the fire was already burning, and Elias had put a pot of something on the stove. She stopped in the doorway. He was at the stove, his back to her, his cane hooked over the counter edge, managing the pot with both hands, and the cabin was warm and bright, and it smelled like coffee and pine, and the particular combination of cold air and wood smoke that she had come to associate with this place, that she had come to think of. She admitted it now privately to herself as home. "Sit down," he said without turning around. "It's just beans, but it'll be hot." She sat down. He brought 2 bowls and set one in front of her, and sat across, and they ate. And she was so tired from 2 days of tension and cold and hard road that she ate with her eyes half closed, and at some point she became aware that he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something unguarded, something that had let the usual layer of careful management fall away entirely. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Elias." He looked at his bowl. "I was thinking that I had no idea when I came down to the valley in August what I was actually coming back with." She was quiet for a moment. "You came back with a woman who eats beans with her eyes closed," she said. "I came back with someone who argues territorial law at a lawyer's office without flinching and finds fraudulent land stakes and writes letters that get lawyers to take cases seriously." He looked up at her. "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Survival," he said. "Just someone to help me survive the winter." "Are you surviving?" Something moved in his expression. "More than that," he said. She held his gaze. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was picking up, and she could hear the horses shifting in the barn, settling in for the night. "Elias," she said quietly, "whatever happens with Caldwell, whatever Webb decides, whatever comes next." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going back down to the valley." He was absolutely still. "I'm not Margaret's to send anywhere anymore," she said. "And I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I chose this. Not at first. At first it was done to me. But somewhere between that first morning with the axe and today in Harwick's office, I chose it. I choose it." She held his gaze. "I want to be clear about that." The silence that followed was the longest he'd given her since she arrived, and she had learned to read his silences now to feel the different weights of them, and this one was not uncertain. It was not the silence of a man deciding. It was the silence of a man who had already decided something and was only now finding the words to confirm it. "I know," he said. "I think I've known for a while. I think—" He was giving her own words back to her, the ones she'd said to him at the kitchen table, when he'd told her he hadn't reckoned on this. She recognized them, and she felt something warm and slightly terrifying move through her chest. "Good," she said, and she meant it the way he'd meant it then, as a beginning rather than an ending, as a door held open rather than closed. She cleared the bowls. She washed them. She was drying the second one when the knock came at the door. Hard, deliberate. The knock of a man who has decided he is not waiting for an invitation. Elias was on his feet before she'd turned around, his cane in his hand, his body already angled toward the door with that particular quality of readiness she had seen once before the day Hatch and Crane rode up the trail. "Whitmore." The voice came through the door deep and carrying the voice of a man accustomed to being heard from a distance. "I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk." Abigail set down the bowl and the cloth very carefully. She looked at Elias. He looked at her. "Open it," she said. He opened the door. Richard Caldwell was a bigger man than she'd imagined from his name. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that cost more than everything Abigail owned, and he had the look of a man who had been handsome once and now used the remnants of it as one more tool. He had 2 men behind him, younger, the kind of young men who hired themselves out for physical proximity to power. His eyes went to Elias first, the habitual dismissal of the damaged leg barely concealed, and then to Abigail, and she watched his expression do something interesting. He had clearly known she was here. He had clearly not expected her to be what she was. She stood at the kitchen table and looked back at him, and did not move. "Caldwell," Elias said. His voice was quiet. It was always quieter when he was more serious. "I hear you went to Glenwood Springs," Caldwell said. "I hear you went to see Harwick." "We did," Elias said. Caldwell's eyes moved back to Abigail. "This you're doing?" "Among other things," she said. He studied her with the appraising look of a man recalibrating. "Margaret Hayes's girl," he said. "I'm nobody's girl," she said. "My name is Abigail Carter." Something shifted in his expression. Not respect men like Caldwell didn't move to respect quickly, but recognition, the particular recognition of a man who has walked into a situation expecting one thing and found another. "You have no legal standing in this matter," he said. "The land is in Whitmore's name. He paused, choosing. "You're hired help." "I'm a witness to a criminal trespass," she said. "And I've signed an affidavit to that effect filed today with Samuel Harwick, attorney at law, with copies dispatched to Federal Land Commissioner Arthur Webb in Santa Fe." She let that sit for a moment. "Is that the kind of standing you mean?" The silence in the cabin went very tight. One of the men behind Caldwell shifted his weight. Caldwell himself didn't move, but something changed in his face. A compression around the jaw, the expression of a man absorbing an unexpected blow and deciding how to respond. "You don't know what you're involved in," he said. His voice had dropped, gotten quieter, and quieter was not better with a man like this. "I know exactly what I'm involved in," she said. "A homesteaded property with documented boundaries established in 1867. A fraudulent survey commissioned by your land trust in 1871. A boundary stake trespassed onto this property and planted between October 9th and 14th of this year. And a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition going back 4 years documented by former county surveyor Alden Briggs, who has agreed to testify before Commissioner Webb." She held his gaze without blinking. "Is there something about that summary you'd like to correct?" Caldwell stared at her. Behind him, the two younger men were very still. Elias had not moved from beside the door. He did not speak. He did not need to. He stood there with his cane and his bad leg and 9 years of this mountain behind him, and Abigail understood looking at him in that moment that his silence was not absence. It was the most complete kind of presence. He was letting her do what she had come here, not to the mountain, to this moment to do. "This isn't finished," Caldwell said. "No," she agreed. "It'll be finished in January in front of Commissioner Webb with documentation." She did not raise her voice. "You should know that whatever you say or do between now and then will also be documented." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "You should have taken the offer," he said. "You should have stopped making it," Elias said. Caldwell turned and walked out. His men followed. The door stayed open behind them, letting in a blast of cold mountain air. And Abigail walked to it and closed it, and stood with her hand on the latch and listened to the sound of horses moving away down the trail. Then she turned around. Elias was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and would not have had words for before tonight, but had words for now. It was the look of a man seeing something fully for the first time, something that had been in front of him for months, that he had been for reasons of grief and caution and the particular wariness of a person who has lost what he loved most, allowing himself to only half see. He saw it now. She saw him see it. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." Her hands were shaking slightly. She looked at them and made them stop. "I've been wanting to say that to someone for approximately 19 years. The sound he made was a laugh. A real one. Brief and low and entirely involuntary, the kind that surprised him as much as it surprised her. And she had never heard it before, and it was the best thing she had heard in a very long time. "Come sit down," he said. "I'm all right. I know you are." He pulled out a chair. "Come sit down anyway." She sat down. Outside, the wind hit the cabin walls in long sustained pushes, the kind that made the timbers talk back. She could hear it finding the gaps around the window frames, feel it in the slight drop of temperature near the floor. She had stopped noticing these things weeks ago, the way you stop noticing a language once you've begun to speak it. The mountain had become a thing she understood in her body now, not just her mind. "He'll make trouble before January," Elias said. He was looking at his coffee cup. "I know. He has men in this county who do what he tells them, not just Hatch, others." He looked up. "It won't be a knock on the door next time." "I know that too." She thought about it honestly. What does he have that could actually stop us if Webb has the documents, if Briggs is testifying what's left that Caldwell can actually do? Delay. Intimidate. Make life on the mountain difficult enough that we decide it isn't worth it. His jaw tightened. He's done it to others. The Linford family 2 ridges east. He didn't take their land through the courts. He made their winter so hard they left in February. How? Cut off their supply line. Had the store in town refused to sell to them. Arranged for their cattle to get spooked off the lower pasture during a freeze. He said it flatly, the flat voice of a man describing something that made him angry, who had decided anger wasn't useful right now. They had 3 children. They couldn't hold on. Abigail sat with that. She thought about the winter ahead, about what hold on actually meant up here, about every vulnerability they had. The supply runs the horses, the fence line, the trail. "We stock up," she said. "Before the road gets bad, everything we might need through March. We stop relying on the town store." She looked at him. "Can we get supplies from Glenwood Springs directly bypassing the local suppliers entirely?" "Harwick knows people. He could arrange it. Then we write him tomorrow. We tell him what we need, and we make sure it's here by the end of November." She set her cup down. "And the fence line, we check it every week. Every marker. If Caldwell sends someone up here again, I want to know about it the same day." Elias was looking at her with that expression again. The one she had started thinking of as his looking at the mountain expression, the same quality of attention he gave the ridge when he was reading the weather. Total, unhurried, taking in everything. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I told you. I am." She looked at him steadily. "I'm scared every day up here. I was scared in that room with Harwick. I was scared just now when Caldwell was standing in this doorway." She picked up her cup again. "But fear and backing down are not the same thing. They never were. I just needed 19 years to figure that out." He reached across the table. A small motion deliberate, and he set his hand over hers on the coffee cup. Not holding, not gripping, just resting there, warm and solid, his calloused hand over her knuckles. She went very still. He didn't say anything. It was not the kind of gesture that needed words. Words would have diminished it, made it smaller than it was. It filled the warm kitchen completely. After a moment, she turned her hand over just slightly, and his fingers closed around hers. They sat that way for a while in the cabin on the mountain, with the fire burning, and the wind outside, and January, and Commissioner Webb and Richard Caldwell, all somewhere ahead of them, real and serious, and requiring everything they had. But not tonight. Tonight, there was just this. 2 people at a plain table holding on. Caldwell did not wait until January. He started the following week, and he started small, the way a man starts something when he wants it to look like coincidence. The supply rider who brought their monthly provisions from the town store arrived with half an order, no cornmeal, no salt pork, no lamp oil, and a note from the storekeeper that said simply unable to fulfill at this time. No explanation, no apology, no offer to correct it. Abigail read the note twice and handed it to Elias. "Hatch owns a share of that store," Elias said. "I know." She had figured that out 2 days ago, going over what she remembered of every conversation she'd had in town since she arrived. "It'll be the feed supplier next, then the hardware. Probably. We already wrote to Harwick. The order won't arrive before December. Then we manage on what we have until it does." She folded the note and set it on the shelf with the other documents. Everything went on the shelf now. Everything got dated and noted. What do we actually need in the next 3 weeks? They went through it together, standing in the kitchen, taking stock of every shelf and corner. and Abigail wrote it down in her notebook, what they had, what they needed, what could be substituted, and what couldn't. Elias knew his supplies the way he knew his fence line exactly, and without sentiment, and together they found they were not as short as the situation was designed to make them feel. "We can make it to December," she said, "if nothing else breaks down." She looked at him. "What's most likely to break down?" "The barn roof has a weak section on the north end. I've been meaning to reinforce it since September." He said it with the particular tone of a man confessing something he'd let slide. "If we get a heavy snow before I get to it." "We'll get to it tomorrow," she said. "What do you need?" "Timber. I have some behind the barn, but not enough. There's a deadfall on the western slope. Good dry pine, I've been meaning to bring it down." "Show me where." He looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. "Show me where the deadfall is, and we'll bring it down together." That was how December began. Not with the quiet she'd imagined winter might bring, but with work constant and demanding, the kind that had its own dignity in it, that made the body ache and the mind go clear and simple. They repaired the barn roof together over 2 cold days, Abigail hauling timber and holding sections, while Elias drove the nails with more precision than she would have thought possible, given what his body cost him in cold weather. He never said a word about the leg. He just worked, and she matched him, and by the second evening, the north wall was solid, and the roof would hold whatever the sky decided to throw at it. She found herself those December days genuinely content in a way she had never been before, and didn't entirely trust, because she had no experience with it to compare. Not happy in any floating, uncomplicated way. Content. The specific contentment of a person doing necessary work alongside someone they respected, in a place that had begun to belong to them, with a threat on the horizon that was real and required everything they had. She thought about that sometimes, that the threat was part of it. That the Caldwell situation, which should have been purely frightening, had become something she was almost grateful for, because it had given her and Elias a shared purpose that was clear and urgent, and had no room in it for the kind of silence where you couldn't tell anymore whether two people were getting closer or just getting used to each other. They were getting closer. She was certain of that now. It showed in small things, the way it always shows in small things between people who are not inclined toward grand gestures. He started telling her things, not because she asked, but because he wanted her to know. Small pieces of history about the land, the neighbors, the valley. One morning over coffee, he told her about his father, a quiet man who had been a carpenter in Pennsylvania, and who had made things that lasted. Another morning, he told her about coming west, for the first time the feeling of standing on open ground, and understanding for the first time what the word vast actually meant. He told her these things in the same direct, spare manner he told her everything, and she listened without rushing to fill the spaces between sentences. And she told him things in return. About her mother and the books. About her father's slow departure from the world after her mother died, the way grief could hollow a person out so thoroughly that what remained looked like a man but functioned more like furniture. About the years in Margaret's house, not cruelty exactly, but erasure being steadily and methodically made smaller than she was, until she had almost forgotten what full-sized felt like. Until the mountain, she said one evening. He looked at her across the table. "This is the first place I've been full-size since I was a child," she said, "since my mother was alive." She looked at her hands. "It surprises me that it took being traded away to get here." "Maybe it took exactly that," he said. She looked up. "Sometimes the only way out is through the worst of it," he said. Ruth believed that. She used to say that the worst thing that ever happened to her was the thing that brought her out here, and out here was the best thing that ever happened to her. He paused. "I used to think after she died that I'd gotten both in the wrong order. That the best thing was supposed to come after the worst thing, not before." "Elias," she said. "I'm not saying—" He stopped himself. He tried again. "I'm saying that I think I understand now what she meant, about the order." He held her gaze. "I think I understand it now." She said nothing for a moment. The fire was loud in the silence. "So do I," she said. The letter from Commissioner Webb arrived on December 18th. Harwick forwarded it from Glenwood Springs with a cover note that said, "Only encouraging." Read carefully. She read it carefully. Webb had received the affidavits and Briggs's documentation. He had assigned the case to his formal review docket, which meant it had the weight of federal jurisdiction and could not be dismissed at the county level. He was scheduled to arrive in the territory on January 9th and would hear testimony in Glenwood Springs on January 12th. He required both Abigail and Elias to be present. He also, in a paragraph near the end that she read 3 times to make sure she'd understood it correctly, noted that Briggs's documentation had prompted him to open a parallel inquiry into 3 other land acquisitions by the Caldwell Trust, and that if the pattern Briggs alleged could be substantiated, the consequences for Caldwell would extend significantly beyond the Whitmore property dispute. She set the letter down. "He's going after more than just us," she said. Elias read it. He read the last paragraph twice. His expression did not change, but something around his eyes shifted, a slight loosening, the look of a man who has been braced for a long time and has just learned that what's coming might be slightly less bad than he'd prepared for. "Briggs," he said. "Briggs," she agreed. "We need to tell him. We'll write tonight." She picked up the letter. "And we need to prepare our testimony, both of us. What we saw when we saw it exactly as it happened. We can't give Webb anything that contradicts the affidavits or each other." "We won't." "I know, but I want to go through it. Out loud. Practice saying it the way you'd say it in a formal proceeding, not the way you'd tell it to someone you know." She looked at him. "Can we do that after supper?" "Yes," he said. So that was how they spent the evenings between Christmas and January, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, going through their testimony, Abigail asking Elias questions the way she imagined Webb would ask them, and then Elias doing the same for her. It was strange and also deeply ordinary, and it became its own kind of intimacy, this particular trust that came from hearing someone say true things over and over in front of you, from knowing their truth and having them know yours, and neither of you being going to deviate from it when it counted. On Christmas Eve, they had no particular acknowledgement of the day, other than that she made apple fritters with the last of the apple butter Margaret had packed in that crate back in August. The crate she could now look back at and almost laugh at the price of her, some provisions and a plow blade. And she brought them to the table, and he looked at them and said, "Where'd you find the sugar for these?" "I've been saving it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "My wife used to make those." "I know," she said. "You told me once. I've been thinking about it since October." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thank you, Abigail." He never used her first name without purpose. She had noticed that from the beginning. When he said Miss Carter, it was formal and correct. When he said just Carter, it was practical shorthand between working partners. When he said Abigail, it was something else, a deliberateness to it, a weight, as if the full name was something he brought out when nothing less would do. They ate apple fritters in the warm cabin on Christmas Eve in the Colorado mountains and didn't talk much, and it was one of the best evenings she could remember. Caldwell's next move came 4 days later. She was checking the fence line on the western edge alone. Elias was in the barn with one of the Grays who'd come up lame when she heard someone on the back trail, not trying to be quiet, moving deliberately the way someone moves when they want to be heard and want you to know they could have come without you hearing if they'd chosen to. She stopped walking. A man came around the bend in the trail, young, well-built. She didn't recognize him. He stopped when he saw her, and he touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, the gesture polite, and the eyes underneath not polite at all. "Ma'am," he said. "You're on private land," she said. "Just passing through." His eyes moved along the fence line, the iron stakes, the markers she'd written down in her notebook. He was looking for something, or confirming something. "You're trespassing," she said. "This land is a matter of active federal inquiry as of December 18th. Any person found on this property without permission of the landowner is subject to—" "I know what I'm subject to," the man said. He looked at her with the particular flatness of someone who has been sent to take a measurement and has found a complication. "Just passing through," he said again. "Then pass through and don't come back," she said. He looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he turned and went back down the trail without another word. She stood with her heart hammering and her face composed, and she waited until the sound of him was entirely gone before she opened her notebook and wrote down the time and his description and the direction he'd come from and gone, and then she walked back to the cabin and told Elias exactly what had happened in exactly the order it had happened. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark coat, brown hat. Young, maybe 25. Scar on his chin left side. He wasn't local. The horse he tied to the trail post was too well bred for anyone in this county that age." Elias nodded slowly. "Caldwell brought someone in." "Yes." She looked at her notebook entry. "He was looking at the markers." "Checking to see if we'd moved any, or confirming their positions before someone comes to move them." Elias was already on his feet, coat in hand. "Where are you going?" she said. "To check every marker on the western line." "I already walked it this morning." "Before he came," Elias said. "I want to walk it after." She got her coat too. They walked the western line together in the late December cold, checking every iron stake, and nothing had been moved, not yet. But the ground around the third marker from the north showed fresh boot prints in the frozen mud that were not hers and were not Elias's, and she wrote it down the moment they got back to the cabin. "He's going to try before January 12th, Elias said. "I think so too. Move a marker, plant a new one, come to Webb with fresh physical evidence that the boundary is disputed, and our claims about the original staking are inaccurate." "It won't work," she said. "The notebook entries are dated. If a marker appears in a different position between now and January 12th, we have documentation that it was in the right position on December 29th. He can't erase that." "He doesn't need to erase it," Elias said. He sat down heavily. The leg had been bad today. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the extra set to his jaw. He needs to make it complicated enough that Webb decides it's a local matter and kicks it back down to the county court. She sat across from him. She thought about that carefully. "Webb's not going to do that," she said. "Not with Briggs's documentation and a federal trespass complaint already on his docket." "You sound certain." "I'm not certain, but I'm betting on it." She looked at him. "Are you?" A long pause. "Yes," he said. "Then we hold on until January 12th, she said. "We check the markers every day. We document everything. We don't give Caldwell anything he can use, and we don't give Webb any reason to doubt us." She leaned forward. "And we go to Glenwood Springs together, and we tell the truth exactly as it happened, and we trust that the truth is enough." Elias looked at her for a long time with that expression she knew as well as her own hands by now. "You know what the hardest part of this has been," he said. "What? Not the cold, not the leg, not even Caldwell." He held her gaze. "The hardest part has been that for 9 years, I did all of this alone, and I got used to alone, and I told myself I preferred it. And now?" He stopped. "And now," she said. "And now I don't know how I did it," he said. "I don't know how I did any of it without someone to think it through with." She felt that land in the center of her chest, felt it settle there warm and permanent. "You don't have to anymore," she said. It was the quietest thing she'd ever said to him, and probably the truest. He reached across the table, and this time she met him halfway, and his hand closed around hers and held on, and she let it. And for a while, neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left that needed saying right now. Only this, the two of them. This table, this cabin, this mountain, that had been his alone for 9 winters, and was not anymore. January arrived like a door being thrown open. The weather cleared on the first, sharp and bright and brutally cold. The kind of cold that made everything look etched, the tree lines black against the white of the snow. The sky so clear and hard, it looked like something you could break. Abigail walked the fence line every morning, notebook in hand, and every morning the markers were where they'd been the morning before. Caldwell's man did not come back. The fence held. She found herself wondering those first days of January whether Caldwell had reconsidered. Whether the combination of Webb's federal jurisdiction and Briggs's parallel inquiry had been enough to make him step back from whatever he'd been planning. She got her answer on January 7th. Elias came in from the road with a letter. He set it on the table and he didn't say anything, which was how she knew it was bad. She opened it. It was from Harwick. It said that Caldwell had filed an emergency injunction in the county court, claiming that Elias had been operating a fraudulent homestead claim since 1867, that the original settlement had been conducted in violation of territorial land ordinance, and that the homestead filing itself was invalid. She read it again. "He's not just contesting the boundary," she said. "He's contesting the homestead. If the homestead is invalid," Elias said, "the land never legally belonged to me. Anything built on it, anything documented from it, none of it holds." "That's the plan," she said. "He couldn't beat us on the boundary, so he's going back to the beginning. He's trying to pull the foundation out." She sat down. She made herself breathe slowly and think clearly. "Can he do it?" she said. "Is there anything wrong with the homestead filing? Anything at all?" "No," Elias said. "Absolute certainty." "Then this is a delay tactic," she said. "He knows he can't win in front of Webb on the boundary dispute, so he's introducing a new front 5 days before the hearing, hoping it creates enough confusion that Webb postpones." Will Webb postpone? She thought about it. Not if Harwick gets there first. She was already on her feet, moving to the shelf where the paper and ink were. "We write to Harwick tonight. We explain what this is and why it's procedurally improper, and we ask him to file an emergency response before January 9th. That's 2 days. Then we better write a good letter." She wrote until midnight. Elias sat with her, reading each draft, suggesting changes. He had a legal mind he'd never developed, but that showed in his instinct for what was solid versus what could be picked apart. By the time she was done, she had 4 pages that Harwick could work from immediately, and she felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has given everything they had to a piece of writing and knows it's the best they can do. Elias sealed the letter while she cleaned the ink from her fingers. "I'll ride down with it before dawn," he said. "Get it to the Glenwood Springs Courier by mid-morning." She looked at him. The leg was already bad in this cold, and a dawn ride on an icy trail. "I'll come with you," she said. "You don't—" "I'll come with you," she said again. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, and that was that. The ride down was hard. The trail was iced over in the switchbacks, and the grays picked their way with the careful reluctance of horses, who know what ice means. And Elias held the reins with both hands, and his jaw set, and didn't say a word about what it cost him. And she didn't offer anything, because she had learned by now that the best way to honor what he did was to acknowledge it without making it into something he had to respond to. They reached the courier station by mid-morning. The man behind the counter looked at the letter, looked at the two of them. A large, quietly determined woman in a wool coat, a scarred man with a carved cane, and the expression of someone who has run out of patience for things that waste his time. And he said the letter would go out with the noon rider. "It needs to be in Glenwood Springs by close of business today," Abigail said. "That's—" He hesitated, recalculating. "That's tight. I know it's tight. Is it possible?" He looked at the clock. He looked at her. "If the noon rider pushes hard." "Tell him to push hard." She put money on the counter, more than the posted rate. "That's for his trouble." The courier looked at the money. He looked at Elias. Something in Elias's face communicated something that didn't need words. The man picked up the money and the letter and said it would go with the noon rider. They stopped at the hotel on the way back through town and ate because they'd left before dawn and needed it. And they sat at a corner table in the near-empty dining room, and Abigail was aware of the 2 or 3 people in the room who recognized Elias and were watching them with the combination of curiosity and judgment that small towns specialized in. She straightened her back and ate her food and did not care. "People are looking," Elias said. "People are always looking," she said. "Let them." He looked at her sideways. "You weren't like that when you first got here." "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." She thought about the woman who had sat in the valley town 4 months ago and made herself small out of long habit and instinct. "The mountain does something to you," she said. "When you survive something difficult every day and it doesn't break you eventually, you stop expecting to be broken." She looked at him. "Did it do that to you?" He considered it for longer than most questions got from him. "Not the mountain," he said. "The work, the doing of it. Every winter I got through up here, I understood a little more that I was not going to be—" He stopped, searched. "Undone," he said finally. "I understood I was not going to be undone." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." He looked at her for a moment longer than was usual, and there was something in the look that felt like recognition, not of what she'd said, but of her, the complete fact of her across from him at this table. "Abigail," he said. When this is done. When Webb rules and Caldwell is dealt with and the land is settled." He looked at his coffee cup. He looked back up at her. "I would like it if you stayed." She was quiet. "Not because I need help through the winter," he said. "Not because the work requires two people, although it does. Because—" He stopped. He seemed almost frustrated with himself with the inadequacy of language for what he was trying to say, which she found deeply and unexpectedly endearing. "Because I don't want to go back to before," he said. "Before you came. I don't want to go back to what that was. And I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything that—" "Elias," she said. He stopped. "I already told you I wasn't going back to the valley," she said. "I know. But I'm asking for more than that." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to stay because you want to. Not because there's nowhere else to go. Because this is where you want to be." She felt the weight of it, the honesty of it, the particular courage it took for this man who had lost everything he loved once before to say that out loud to another person. "It is where I want to be," she said. "It has been for a while. You're the last one to figure it out." Something in his face shifted entirely, something carefully held releasing all at once, and it transformed him not into someone different, but into a fuller version of who he already was, as if he had been slightly contracted and had just expanded to his actual size. "All right," he said. She picked up her coffee. "All right," she agreed. They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon light, with January cold biting through their coats and the trail hard under the horses' feet, and she was aware of him beside her. The solid fact of him, the steadiness. And she thought about what the valley had traded her away into, and she thought about $30 and a plow blade, and she thought that some prices were so wrong they accidentally became right, that some transactions that looked like loss were actually from the right distance, and with enough time, something else entirely. She thought I was sent here to survive. She thought I came here and did something considerably more than that. Harwick's emergency response reached Commissioner Webb on January 10th. Abigail knew this because Harwick sent word by fast writer, a single line on a folded paper, "Response filed." Webb acknowledged. "Hearing proceeds January 12th as scheduled." She read it standing at the door in the cold, and she pressed the paper flat against her palm, and she said quietly to no one in particular, "All right then." Elias was behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know his expression. "We leave at first light," she said. "Yes," he said. They rode down the mountain on the morning of January 12th, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern range. The cold was the sharpest it had been all winter, the kind that made the horses blow great clouds of vapor, and made every breath feel like swallowing something solid. Abigail had on every layer she owned, and still felt it in her fingertips by the time the trail leveled out, and Glenwood Springs came into view below them. She did not complain. She sat straight and kept her hands warm inside her coat pockets, and thought through her testimony one more time quietly in order the way she had done every night for 2 weeks. The hearing room at the Federal Land Office was smaller than she'd expected, and more crowded than she was prepared for. Word had gotten out that was clear from the number of people standing along the back wall, some of whom she recognized as valley settlers, men and women who had been watching the Caldwell situation from a distance and had made the trip to see how it resolved. She saw Pete Garner from the feed store. She saw the Linford man whose family had been pushed off their land, 2 ridges east, standing near the door with his hat in his hands and an expression that was equal parts hope and old grief. She saw Briggs already seated at the front, his big hands folded on the table, his furrow between his eyebrows deeper than usual. She did not see Caldwell at first. Then she did. He was in the far corner with 2 men she didn't recognize, and a lawyer she recognized as James Aldrin, who had a reputation in the territory for being expensive and effective and entirely comfortable with the kind of cases where the truth was a starting point for negotiation rather than a destination. Caldwell looked at her when she came in. She looked back at him without pause, without flinching, and then she looked away, because he was not the most important thing in this room. Commissioner Arthur Webb was a man in his 60s, with white hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a career in rooms full of people trying to get him to do things he hadn't decided to do yet. He had a face that gave nothing away, which Abigail had learned to read as a good sign in a decision-maker. The ones with readable faces had usually already decided. He called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock without preamble, which she liked. Harwick presented their case first. The homestead filing the dated notebook entries, the fraudulent stake Briggs's documentation. He laid it out in 20 minutes with the clean precision of a man who had spent 30 years reducing complicated things to their essential truth, and Abigail watched Webb's face while he talked and saw nothing but attention, the deep, genuine kind. Then Aldrin presented Caldwell's case, which was the boundary dispute reframed as a pattern of encroachment combined with the emergency injunction challenging the homestead filing itself. And he did it smoothly, with the confidence of a man accustomed to the weight of money behind his arguments. When Aldrin finished, Webb looked up from his papers and said, "I have a question for Miss Carter." Abigail stood. "You found the fraudulent stake," Webb said. "I did. Describe exactly what you saw when you found it." She described it. She described it in the same order she had written it in her notebook. The same words, the same precise sequence of detail, because she had told the truth so many times in the past 2 weeks that it came out now clean and unadorned and absolutely certain. Webb listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "And you documented this before the survey claim was filed with the county." On October 14th, the claim was filed November 2nd. She reached into her coat and produced the notebook. "The entry is dated, signed by both myself and Mr. Whitmore. I can provide the notebook for your examination." She walked it to his table and set it down in front of him. He opened it. He looked at the entry. He looked at both signatures. He looked up at Caldwell's table. "Mr. Aldrin," he said, "your client's survey claim was filed after a fraudulent boundary marker was documented on the homesteaded property. Would you like to explain the sequence of events that produced that situation?" Aldrin began a response about clerical timing and survey procedure. Webb let him go for approximately 30 seconds before he held up one hand. "That's enough," Webb said. The room went very quiet. Caldwell shifted in his chair. One of the men beside him leaned in and said something in his ear. Caldwell didn't move. Webb turned his attention to Briggs. Briggs stood without being asked. He was a man who had been waiting for this room for 2 years, and it showed in the way he carried himself, straight-backed, deliberate, the bearing of someone who has thought carefully about what he's going to say and is not going to be moved from it. He laid out the surveyor's pattern over 15 minutes. He named every parcel. He cited every discrepancy between the survey data and the physical measurements. He explained in terms so plain that even someone who had never read a land document could follow how the same error in the same direction repeated 9 times was not error at all. When Briggs sat down, the room had a different quality to it. Abigail could feel it, the shift in the air that happens when a group of people simultaneously arrives at the same conclusion. Aldrin made one more attempt. He stood and said with the smooth confidence of a man who has talked his way out of worse, that Mr. Briggs's testimony was the account of a disgruntled former colleague with a personal grievance, and that the clerical inconsistencies he described were well within the margins of survey variance. "Mr. Aldrin." Webb's voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because rooms went quiet for it without being asked to. Are you telling me that a systematic directional discrepancy across 9 separate surveys conducted by the same surveyor, all resulting in land transfers that benefited the same purchaser, falls within normal variance? Silence. Because if you are. Webb said, I would like that claim in writing signed by you personally before we go further. Aldrin sat down. The room let out a breath. Abigail felt Elias's hand close around hers under the table. She had not realized he'd moved it. She did not let go. Webb deliberated for 20 minutes. He went into a back room, and the door closed, and the room full of people waited with the particular weighted silence of people who have done everything they can do and are now at the mercy of someone else's judgment. Abigail looked at the closed door. She did not look at Caldwell. She did not look at Aldrin. She looked at the closed door, and she thought about every choice that had led to this room. The Friday morning, she had stood at the edge of Margaret's yard with one suitcase and a broken heart. The first night in the cabin with the bolt on the inside of the door. The morning with the axe. The walk to the western fence line. The fraudulent stake in the frozen ground. Every choice hers and Elias's, every piece of paper on that shelf, every letter written by lamplight, every morning they had gotten up and done what needed doing without knowing for certain that it was going to be enough. Elias's thumb moved slightly against her hand. She looked at him. Whatever he decides, Elias said quietly. You should know that this... He paused. Whatever he decides today, this has already been decided. Between us. On the mountain. He held her gaze. That doesn't depend on what happens in this room. She felt something crack open in her chest, clean and bright, the way a log cracks when the cold finally gets fully into it. I know, she said. The door opened. Webb came back in and sat down and spread his papers in front of him and looked up at the room with that unreadable face. I've reviewed the documentation, he said. I've heard testimony from all parties. I'm going to be direct. He looked at Caldwell's table. The survey filed by Benjamin Pratt on behalf of the Caldwell Land Trust on November 2nd of this year is fraudulent, he said. The directional discrepancies identified by Mr. Briggs are not within any recognized standard of variance. The physical evidence of trespass documented by Miss Carter and Mr. Whitmore prior to the filing date establishes premeditation. He let that word sit in the air for a moment. I am invalidating the survey claim in its entirety. I am forwarding the matter of criminal trespass to the Federal Marshal's Office for investigation, and I am opening a formal inquiry into the 3 additional land acquisitions identified by Mr. Briggs. He looked at Caldwell directly, and his voice did not change in volume or tone, but it changed in some other quality that Abigail felt in her spine. Mr. Caldwell, he said, you should retain counsel, not for this hearing, for what comes next. The room erupted. Not in chaos, in the particular release of people who have been holding something for a long time and have just been given permission to let it go. She heard Pete Garner make a sound somewhere behind her. She heard the Linford man say something she couldn't make out. She heard Briggs beside her exhale one long, slow breath that sounded like it had been waiting in him for 2 years. She looked at Elias. He was looking at her with that expression she had come to know completely, the one that was not quite a smile, because his face didn't move to smiling easily. But that was something more than a smile, in the depth of it. Something that lived behind the eyes and was entirely for her. We're going home, she said. Yes, he said. We are. They did not stay for what came after. Let Harwick manage the paperwork. Let Aldrin make whatever conciliatory gestures he was going to make. Let Caldwell sit with what had just happened to him in a room full of people who had been waiting for it. Abigail and Elias walked out of that hearing room and into the cold January air, and she stood on the street for a moment and breathed it in, the cold and the sky and the particular feeling of a thing being finished properly, finished the way things so rarely were. Abigail. She turned. It was Clara. She had not expected Clara. She had not seen her in the room, which meant she had come after, had heard somehow, and come. Her stepsister was standing on the street in front of her with her dark eyes and her careful way of arranging herself and an expression Abigail had never seen on her face before. Not the pretty girl composure. Something stripped of that, something underneath. "I heard it was today," Clara said. "I came from the valley this morning. Mother doesn't know I'm here." "All right," Abigail said. "Is it done?" "It's done." Clara looked at her for a long moment. She looked at Elias, who stood slightly to Abigail's left, and a half step back, not behind her, beside her, and then she looked back at Abigail. "You look different," Clara said. "I am different." "I know." Clara's voice dropped. "I knew it the morning you left, when you didn't look back at the house." She paused. "I watched from the upstairs window. You never once looked back." Abigail hadn't known she'd been watched. She thought about that 19-year-old woman in the wagon sitting straight eyes forward, telling herself she wasn't leaving anything good behind. "I didn't have a reason to," she said. "No." Clara's jaw tightened, and Abigail saw something that surprised her. Not guilt exactly, but its more complicated cousin, the feeling of a person who has understood something too late to have made a different choice, but early enough to know what the cost of the wrong choice was. "I want you to know that I told her. After you left. I told her what she'd done wasn't right, and I told her that if you came back and asked for anything, you were owed it." A pause. She didn't agree, but I said it. "I know you did what you could, Clara." "It wasn't enough." "No," Abigail agreed. "It wasn't, but I'm not." She stopped. She thought about what she actually felt standing here. And it was not anger, not anymore, and it was not forgiveness exactly either, because forgiveness implied something could be addressed by an attitude. What she felt was distance. Clean, established distance. The kind that comes not from cutting something off, but from simply having grown far enough away from it that it no longer determined the shape of where you were. "I'm not living inside it anymore," she said. "What happened? I'm not living inside it." Clara looked at her for a long moment, and something in Clara's face changed. Something softened and complicated the expression of a young woman beginning to understand things her mother had never let her understand. "Are you happy?" Clara said. It came out almost tentative. Abigail looked at Elias beside her. He was looking at her with that expression. Just that expression, quiet and certain and entirely present. "Yes," she said. "I am." Clara nodded. She looked at Elias. She said, "Thank you for taking care of her." And Elias said without hesitation, "She took care of herself. I just had the sense not to get in her way." Clara almost smiled. It was genuine, and the sight of it did something unexpectedly tender to Abigail's chest. "Goodbye, Clara," she said. "Goodbye, Abigail." They turned and walked to where the horses were tied, and Abigail did not look back. And it meant something entirely different this time than it had meant the last time she had made that choice. The road back up was long and cold, and the horses were tired, and they went slowly, and she did not mind any of it. She sat beside Elias in the wagon, and the mountain came toward them as they climbed the ridge, appearing above the tree line in the late afternoon light, and she felt the particular pull of it, the thing that a place becomes when it has asked everything of you, and you have given it, and it has given something back that you could not have gotten anywhere else. They did not talk much on the road up. They didn't need to. What there was between them did not require maintenance. At this point, did not require filling in with words to keep it alive. It was alive without that had been alive without that for months. It was only when the cabin appeared through the trees and the horses picked up their pace, recognizing home, that Elias said, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him. "I need to ask you properly," he said. He said it with the gravity of a man who has thought about this for some time and has decided the time is now. "What's been between us the way we've built this thing? I need to ask you if you'll make it formal." He looked at her steadily, his gray eyes absolutely certain. "Abigail Carter, will you marry me?" It was not a question the way he said it. It was a man stating what he wanted and asking if she wanted it too plainly the way he did everything, with no ornamentation and no performance, just the raw, honest weight of the thing itself. She sat with it for exactly 1 moment. "Yes," she said. "I will." He nodded once the way he nodded when something was confirmed and could now be relied upon. She almost laughed. She loved that about him. They brought the horses in and fed them and broke the ice in the bucket, and she made supper while he started the fire, and when they sat down to eat, it was an ordinary supper, in an ordinary cabin on a Colorado mountain. And it was also the beginning of the rest of their lives. And both of those things were true simultaneously. And neither one diminished the other. Margaret sent a letter 3 weeks later. Abigail read it once and set it on the shelf with the other documents, then thought about it and took it down and read it a second time. It was not an apology. Margaret did not apologize. She said she had heard about the hearing, that she understood Abigail had done well for herself, that she hoped the matter with the land had been sorted. She asked after Abigail's health. At the end, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest, she had written, "Your father would have been proud." Abigail sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote back. A short letter, 4 sentences. She said she was well. She said the land matter was resolved. She said she had news that she and Elias were to be married in the spring. She signed it Abigail Carter Whitmore, though it was not yet legally true. It would be. She sealed the letter and put it on the shelf to go down with the next writer, and she turned back to the kitchen and found Elias standing in the doorway, watching her with that expression she had come to know better than any other face she had ever known. "Letter to Margaret," he said. "Yes." "You all right?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things now, with the directness that the mountain had given her, or that had always been in her, and the mountain had simply made room for. "Yes," she said. "I am." He came into the kitchen. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her and sat down across from her, both hands around his cup, the way he always sat, and the fire burned, and the wind worked at the corners of the cabin, and the mountain held them both in its enormous, cold, indifferent embrace. Spring came late to that ridge the way it always did, grudgingly. In fits and starts, the snow retreating and returning twice before it finally gave up entirely, and the ground softened, and the first green appeared at the margins of the kitchen garden, and the aspens on the lower slope put out their tiny, trembling leaves. Abigail and Elias Whitmore were married on a Saturday in April by a circuit preacher who came through the valley once a month, and who looked at the two of them, the large, capable woman and the scarred man with the carved cane, and performed the ceremony with a simplicity and dignity that suited them both entirely. Pete Garner was there. Briggs made the ride from Glenwood Springs. The Linford man came, the one who had stood in the hearing room with his hat in his hands, and he brought his wife and his 3 children. And his wife cried at the ceremony for reasons that had nothing to do with sentimentality, and everything to do with what it meant to see something won back from men who had no right to take it. Clara was not there. But 3 days before the wedding, a small package arrived from the valley, and inside it was a length of blue wool fabric, fine quality, with a note in Clara's careful handwriting that said only, "For whatever you need it for, with love." Abigail made a dress from it. She wore it at the wedding. Richard Caldwell's land acquisitions were reviewed by the Federal Marshal's Office through the spring of 1877. 3 of the 9 properties were returned to their original owners. Pratt, the surveyor, lost his license and left the territory. Caldwell himself was not imprisoned. Men of his standing rarely were in those days or these, but he lost the spring access he had been working toward for 7 years, and the legal costs of what followed ate deeply into what he'd built, and he left the county before summer was out and did not come back. The valley talked about it for a long time. They talked about Elias Whitmore, who had survived 9 winters alone on that ridge and had held his land when a powerful man tried to take it. And they talked about his wife. They talked about the woman who had arrived from the valley in the summer of 1876 with 1 small suitcase and a broken heart, the woman everyone had watched get traded away like something disposable, the woman they had whispered about and pitied and dismissed. They talked about what she had done in a lawyer's office in Glenwood Springs, how she had walked in without fear and asked the right questions. They talked about the testimony she'd given before a federal commissioner that had undone 7 years of a powerful man's scheme. They talked about the way she had stood in her own doorway and faced Richard Caldwell and named every piece of evidence against him while he stood there expecting to find someone breakable. She was not breakable. She had never been breakable. She had only ever been underestimated, which was a different thing entirely, and which, as it turned out, had been the last mistake anyone who underestimated her ever made, twice. Years later, travelers passing through the Colorado mountains would stop at a cabin on the northern ridge, a solid, well-built place with a covered porch and a kitchen garden, and 2 heavy-boned gray horses in the barn, and they would be welcomed in by a woman who knew how to feed people well, and a man with a carved cane and quiet gray eyes. And they would sit at a long pine table and eat and be warm, and they would leave feeling something they sometimes struggled to name. But that had to do with the simple, visible fact of 2 people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of what they were choosing and had not once looked back. Abigail Carter Whitmore had been traded for $30 and a plow blade. She had become the strongest thing on that mountain. And the mountain, which had seen everything and forgot nothing, knew it from the very beginning.